June 12, 1994 started like the kind of day families remember forever, bright, warm, and impossibly calm. The Montana sky stretched wide and blue above the pine-covered mountains, and the air carried that fresh, earthy scent that only exists deep in the wilderness. Mark Harper had mapped out the trail weeks earlier, wanting something scenic but manageable. It was supposed to be a bonding trip. A break from school, work, and the noise of everyday life. Ethan and Evan were 12, identical twins, but opposites in personality. Ethan was louder, always leading the way, always daring his brother to go faster. Evan was quieter, more observant, the kind of kid who noticed bird calls and animal tracks. That morning, they could barely contain their excitement. They'd packed their own small backpacks, snacks, a flashlight, a whistle their dad insisted they carry just in case. They rolled their eyes at that. Nothing bad ever happened on family hikes. The trailhead was nearly empty when they arrived. Just one other pickup truck parked near the entrance. Linda pointed it out casually, but Mark shrugged it off. It was summer, hikers were everywhere this time of year. The wooden sign at the entrance read Bear Creek Trail, 6.4 miles. Underneath, someone had carved initials into the wood. The forest beyond looked thick but inviting, sunlight cutting through the trees in long golden beams. As they started walking, the gravel crunched beneath their boots. Birds scattered overhead. The twins moved ahead of their parents almost immediately, arguing about who would spot wildlife first. Their laughter echoed through the trees, bouncing off the canyon walls. Every so often, Mark would call out, "Not too far," and Ethan would shout back, "We're good, Dad." That confidence, that carefree certainty that nothing in the world could touch them out here. About a mile in, the sounds of civilization disappeared completely. No distant cars. No cell service. Just wind brushing against pine needles and the steady rush of a creek somewhere ahead. The deeper they walked, the denser the forest became. Shadows stretched longer across the path, even though it was barely past noon. And if anyone had been watching from between those trees, silent, patient, the Harper family would have never known. By the time they reached the narrow bend near Bear Creek, the trail had grown quieter. The twins were still ahead, maybe 50 or 60 yards in front, their voices drifting back in quick bursts of laughter. Mark could hear Ethan teasing Evan about slipping on a rock. Then came the sound of shoes skidding across gravel, playful, harmless. Linda smiled, shaking her head. "They've got too much energy," she said, adjusting the straps on her backpack. At 2:17 p.m., Linda called out casually, "Boys, slow down a little." No answer. That wasn't unusual at first. The creek nearby was loud, water rushing over smooth stones, drowning out softer sounds. Mark cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Ethan! Evan!" His voice echoed off the trees, swallowed almost immediately by the forest. Still nothing. No laughter. No response. Just the steady current of water moving past. They rounded the bend expecting to see the boys waiting up ahead. Instead, the trail was empty. Two sets of small footprints were visible in the soft dirt, leading straight toward the creek's edge. The water wasn't deep, maybe knee-high at most, clear enough to see the rocks beneath the surface. On one side, thick brush pressed close to the bank. On the other, the forest climbed upward into shadow. The footprints stopped right where the dirt met the water. Linda felt the first wave of panic hit her chest. "Mark," she said, her voice suddenly thinner. Mark stepped forward quickly, scanning the area. No backpacks on the ground. No dropped snack wrappers. No sign of a struggle. He expected to hear a splash, a giggle, something to suggest they were hiding behind a tree, waiting to jump out. He even forced a tight smile and called out, "Okay, joke's over." His words felt weak in the open air. Then something shifted. The forest had gone still. No birds. No wind. No movement in the brush. Just the creek flowing past the place where two boys had been standing seconds earlier. By nightfall, the woods no longer felt peaceful. Flashlights cut through the trees in sharp white beams, and the steady thrum of helicopter blades echoed across the canyon. What had started as two frantic parents calling their sons' names had turned into a full-scale emergency response. Park rangers sealed off Bear Creek Trail. Deputies from neighboring counties arrived within hours. By midnight, search and rescue teams were combing through miles of forest in organized grids. Bloodhounds were brought in just after sunrise. The dogs circled the area where the footprints ended, sniffing the damp soil, whining low in their throats. They picked up Ethan and Evan's scent instantly, following it straight toward the creek. Handlers moved carefully behind them, hope flickering across exhausted faces. But when the dogs reached the water's edge, they stopped. Confused. Tails stiff. The scent trail dissolved completely in the rushing current. Divers were deployed that afternoon. The creek was shallow in places but deep and unpredictable in others, with hidden pockets carved out beneath the surface by years of erosion. Cold mountain water made visibility difficult. For hours, divers searched downstream, feeling blindly along the riverbed. They found fishing line, old soda cans, fallen branches, but nothing that belonged to two 12-year-old boys. Within 48 hours, national news outlets picked up the story. Cameras lined the trailhead. Reporters stood in front of the pine-covered hills delivering updates with solemn expressions. Montana twins missing during family hike, the headlines read. Their school photos appeared on television screens across America. Identical smiles, matching freckles, bright summer haircuts. The country watched. And waited. Volunteers poured in by the hundreds. Local ranchers rode horseback through rugged terrain. Off-road vehicles combed logging paths. Thermal imaging scanned the forest at night. Tips flooded in from across state lines, alleged sightings, suspicious strangers, theories from armchair detectives. Every lead was followed. Every rumor was checked. And with each passing day, the search radius grew wider. But the forest gave nothing back. When weeks turned into months, the official search slowed, but the theories didn't. In fact, they multiplied. Law enforcement held press conferences urging the public not to speculate, but speculation was all anyone had left. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without even a single confirmed sighting, the disappearance of Ethan and Evan Harper became a vacuum, and people rushed to fill it. The first and most obvious theory was drowning. Investigators reconstructed the scene dozens of times. Could the twins have slipped on wet rocks and been carried downstream? Hydrologists studied the creek's current patterns. They calculated water levels from that exact date in 1994. But there was a problem. The creek simply wasn't powerful enough that afternoon to pull two healthy 12-year-olds under without a sound. And if it had, something, a shoe, a backpack, a scrap of clothing, should have surfaced eventually. Nothing ever did. Then came the abduction theory. A witness came forward claiming they'd seen an older man sitting alone near the trailhead earlier that day. He was described as wearing a tan fishing vest and a dark baseball cap. Authorities tracked down dozens of similar-looking men across Montana and neighboring states. None connected. No criminal records linked to child abduction. No forensic evidence tying anyone to the scene. Still, the idea that someone had been watching the trail that day refused to fade. In online forums, still new in the mid-90s but growing, darker theories began circulating. Some believed the boys had been lured away by someone pretending to need help. Others whispered about illegal hunting camps hidden deep in the forest, places off the official maps. A few locals even insisted the area had a history of unexplained disappearances dating back decades. None of it was confirmed. But the longer the silence stretched, the more believable even the wildest theories started to feel. By the early 2000s, the case file had grown thick with interviews, search maps, and unanswered questions. Detectives rotated in and out as years passed. Leads dried up. Funding shifted elsewhere. The Harper twins became a cold case, another unsolved mystery filed away in a metal cabinet. But somewhere inside those pages were inconsistencies investigators couldn't quite ignore. Details that didn't line up. Small things that didn't make sense. Time moved forward for everyone else. It moved differently for the Harpers. The seasons kept changing in Montana. Heavy winters, muddy springs, bright endless summers. But inside their home, June 12, 1994 never really ended. Ethan and Evan's bedroom stayed exactly the way it had been that morning. Two twin beds pushed against opposite walls. Posters of baseball players curling slightly at the corners. A pair of sneakers still lined up neatly by the closet door. Linda dusted the room every week. Mark never said anything about it. Birthdays became the hardest. Each year, Linda baked 2 chocolate cakes, just like she had when the boys were little. She lit 12 candles. Then 13. Then 14. She stopped counting after 25. The candles kept increasing, even though no one was there to blow them out. Mark would stand quietly at the kitchen window, staring out at the mountains in the distance, as if expecting 2 grown men to come walking down the driveway at any moment. Friends tried to help at first. Casseroles. Phone calls. Church gatherings. But sympathy has a lifespan. Over time, invitations slowed. Conversations became awkward. People didn't know what to say anymore. Some believed the boys had drowned and thought the family should accept it. Others believed they were taken and still alive somewhere. The uncertainty became its own kind of weight, heavier than grief, sharper than loss. Every year on the anniversary, Mark and Linda returned to Bear Creek Trail. They walked the same path, stopped at the same bend, stared at the same water. The creek never changed. It kept flowing, indifferent, steady, almost peaceful. Linda would close her eyes and listen carefully, convinced that if she stood still long enough, she might hear laughter again. Sometimes the wind through the trees almost sounded like it. Law enforcement eventually stopped calling. The case was labeled inactive but open, a technical phrase that meant nothing was happening. The file gathered dust. Technology moved forward. DNA science evolved. Missing children from the 80s and 90s began getting answers through breakthroughs no one could have imagined back then. And quietly, inside an FBI database, the Harper twins case sat waiting, untouched for decades, until someone decided to look at it again. In the spring of 2024, Bear Creek flooded harder than it had in decades. Snowmelt from the mountains rushed down in violent waves, shifting rocks that hadn't moved since the 90s. Entire sections of the creek bed were rearranged. Fallen logs broke loose. Mud banks collapsed. When the water finally receded weeks later, the landscape looked subtly different, like the forest had exhaled after holding its breath for 30 years. That's when the FBI's cold case unit stepped in. Using updated forensic mapping and ground-penetrating radar, agents began rescanning areas that had been searched countless times before. Technology had changed. What once required guesswork could now be analyzed with precision. Drones hovered low over the water. Sonar equipment mapped beneath the surface in high resolution. Agents focused carefully on the exact location where the twins' footprints had stopped back in 1994. Late one afternoon, a field analyst noticed something unusual on the sonar display. A dense object tangled beneath a collapsed log near the original disappearance point. It wasn't large, but it wasn't natural either. Divers were sent in immediately. The water was murky from recent storms, visibility near zero. One diver reached beneath the log and felt fabric. Heavy, waterlogged. He tugged gently, and something small came loose in his hand. A jacket. Then another. One blue. One red. Both youth-sized. The material was weathered but intact, preserved beneath layers of sediment and debris. Agents carefully laid them out on a white evidence tarp near the bank. Even after decades, the colors were faintly visible. Inside one pocket, they found a small rusted whistle attached to a frayed string. Inside the other, faded ink on a stitched name tag, Ethan Harper. But when forensic testing began, the results made investigators pause. The fabric showed signs of prolonged moisture exposure, but not 30 years' worth. Soil analysis suggested the jackets had been buried in sediment for significantly less time than expected. There was no advanced fiber breakdown consistent with decades underwater. No heavy mineral deposits typical of long-term submersion. Which meant one thing. Those jackets hadn't been there the entire time. The moment forensic analysts confirmed the jackets hadn't been underwater for 30 years, the entire investigation shifted direction. This was no longer just a missing persons case buried in the past. This was active. Immediate. Someone had placed those jackets in the creek long after 1994, and likely believed no one would ever find them. Agents quietly began reviewing the original search records from June 1994. Thousands of pages. Volunteer sign-in sheets. Ranger reports. Media access logs. Anyone who had been near Bear Creek in the days following the disappearance was re-examined through a modern lens. One name surfaced repeatedly. A seasonal park volunteer who had assisted in coordinating early search grids. Back then, he'd been described as helpful, calm, cooperative. But something stood out. He had requested access to restricted search zones multiple times during the first week. Areas close to the creek. At the time, it didn't raise suspicion. Everyone was desperate to help. Yet after the official search scaled back, he abruptly left Montana. No forwarding address. No farewell to fellow volunteers. Records showed he resurfaced years later in another state under a slightly altered version of his name. The FBI tracked financial records. Employment history. Quiet interviews with former neighbors. Nothing dramatic surfaced. No arrests, no obvious criminal background. Just inconsistencies. Gaps in employment. A pattern of relocating every few years. And one unsettling detail. He had lived less than 40 miles from Bear Creek again for a brief period in the early 2000s. Meanwhile, agents returned to the jackets. Trace analysis revealed microscopic plant material embedded in the fibers, vegetation that didn't grow near the creek but did grow several miles deeper into the forest. That detail was never made public. Neither was the fact that faint DNA traces were recovered from inside one sleeve, degraded, partial, but not belonging to either twin. Mark and Linda received a phone call late one evening. For the first time in decades, investigators didn't speak in past tense. They didn't use words like tragic accident or probable drowning. Instead, they used phrases like ongoing activity and new forensic developments. Hope is a dangerous thing after 30 years. It doesn't arrive gently. It hits like lightning. And somewhere out there, whether in Montana or beyond, someone now knows the silence is breaking. For 30 years, the forest kept its secret. Two boys walked ahead on a quiet summer trail and vanished into silence. No screams. No witnesses. No answers. Just a creek that kept flowing like nothing ever happened. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Somebody went back to that water. Somebody placed those jackets there. And somebody has been living with the truth all this time. The FBI says the case is active. Which means somewhere, right now, a person who thought they got away with it is watching the news, hearing the whispers, wondering how much investigators really know. And maybe the real question isn't what happened to Ethan and Evan Harper. Maybe the real question is, who was close enough to hide the evidence, and patient enough to wait 30 years? Because the forest doesn't forget. And neither does the truth.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.